Every time he succeeded, he found a way to destroy it all. David Brennan had perfected the art of almost. Almost promoted to senior partner at the law firm before the inappropriate email he, quote, accidentally sent to all staff. Almost closing the biggest deal of his career before missing the crucial client dinner due to a food poisoning that materialized an hour before the meeting. Almost proposing to Rachel, the woman he'd loved for 3 years, before picking a fight so devastating she moved out the next day. At 35, David's life was a graveyard of almosts, each one expertly crafted to look like bad luck, poor timing, or circumstances beyond his control. But sitting in his empty apartment on a Tuesday evening, staring at yet another termination letter, this time from Morrison and Associates, where he'd been the most promising junior partner until he wasn't, David finally asked himself a question that had been lurking in the shadows of his consciousness for years. Am I doing this to myself? The thought was so disturbing, so contrary to everything he believed about his own desires and motivations, that he dismissed it immediately. David Brennan was ambitious, driven, desperate for success. He wasn't self-destructive, he was just unlucky. But the question wouldn't leave him alone. 3 weeks later, David sat across from Dr. Michael Torres in a therapy office that felt uncomfortably intimate for someone who'd spent his entire adult life maintaining professional distance from anything resembling emotional vulnerability. "I'm here because my sister thinks I have a pattern," David said, his voice carrying the same dismissive tone he'd used to discuss a frivolous lawsuit. "She's convinced I sabotage myself. I think I just have bad timing." Dr. Torres, a man in his early 50s with the kind of calm presence that made defensive people want to either confess everything or flee immediately, nodded without judgment. "Tell me about your bad timing." David launched into what had become his well-rehearsed narrative. The email system glitch that sent his sarcastic comment about the senior partners to everyone in the firm. The sudden onset of food poisoning that had never been confirmed by any medical test. The argument with Rachel that had escalated from a minor disagreement about wedding venues to accusations of emotional unavailability. "It sounds like a series of unfortunate events," Dr. Torres observed. "What do you think connects them?" "Nothing connects them. That's the point. They're just coincidences." "Tell me about the email at your firm. What exactly did you write?" David shifted uncomfortably. "It was just venting. I wrote something about how the partners were. Old boys club dinosaurs who wouldn't recognize innovation if it bit them on their Armani-suited asses. I meant to send it to my friend Jake, but I hit reply all instead." "Had you been drinking?" "No, I was completely sober, just frustrated." "What were you frustrated about?" "They just announced the partnership track promotions. I was being fast-tracked for senior associate, which meant I'd probably make junior partner within 2 years. Dr. Torres leaned forward slightly. "So you were getting good news when you sent the email that destroyed your career there?" The question hung in the air like an accusation David wasn't ready to face. "It was an accident," he said, but something in his voice suggested he was trying to convince himself as much as Dr. Torres. But what David couldn't tell Dr. Torres, what he'd never told anyone, was what had happened in the moments before sending that email. He'd been sitting at his desk, staring at the partnership announcement, when an image had flashed through his mind. His father, drunk and bitter, ranting about entitled rich boys who thought they were better than everyone else. His father, who'd worked construction his whole life and died believing that success was something that happened to other people, people who didn't deserve it as much as he did, but who got it anyway through luck or corruption or being born into the right family. "Success is for people who sell their souls," his father used to say. "Good people, real people, they struggle. That's how you know you're decent." David had fought against that programming his entire life, working twice as hard as everyone else to prove he could succeed without selling his soul, without becoming one of the entitled ones his father despised. But in that moment, staring at his name on the partnership track, he'd felt something unexpected: shame. As if by succeeding, he was betraying every value his father had tried to instill in him. The email had been sent less than 10 minutes later. "David," Dr. Torres continued, "tell me about your childhood relationship with success." "What do you mean? How was achievement viewed in your family? What happened when you did well in school, sports, anything?" David thought back to childhood report cards, little league games, academic awards. "My father, he was proud, I think, but he was also suspicious. He'd say things like, 'Don't get too big for your britches,' or 'Remember where you come from.'" What did those messages mean to you as a child? That success was dangerous. That if I achieved too much, I'd become someone he wouldn't recognize, someone he wouldn't like. And how does that connect to your adult experiences? David felt something uncomfortable shifting in his chest. I don't know, maybe it doesn't. But he did know. He'd always known, somewhere beneath the carefully constructed narrative of bad luck and poor timing. Every success felt like a betrayal of his origins, every achievement like evidence that he was becoming exactly the kind of person his father had taught him to despise. So he sabotaged them, not consciously, not deliberately, but with the precision of someone whose unconscious mind had been trained to view success as a moral failing. "David, what would happen if you actually succeeded? If you became senior partner, married Rachel, achieved everything you say you want?" "I'd be happy, obviously. But what else? What would it mean about who you are?" David was quiet for a long time, wrestling with thoughts he'd never allowed himself to fully form. "It would mean I'm not the person my father raised me to be. It would mean I joined the other side." "What's the other side?" "The entitled ones. The ones who think they're better than people like where I come from." Dr. Torres made a note. "So succeeding would make you someone you've been taught to view as morally inferior." When you put it like that, it sounds ridiculous. Does it feel ridiculous? David considered the question honestly for the first time. No, it feels true. The admission hung between them like a bridge David wasn't sure he was ready to cross. But what disturbed David most wasn't the recognition of the pattern. It was realizing how sophisticated his sabotage had become. The food poisoning that had cost him the biggest deal of his career hadn't been psychosomatic. He had eaten gas station sushi 12 hours before the client dinner, despite having an iron stomach and years of carefully maintained dietary habits. He'd chosen to eat something virtually guaranteed to make him sick. At some level, he'd known exactly what he was doing. "I need to tell you something," David said during his third session with Dr. Torres. "I think I might have made myself sick on purpose, the night before the Henderson deal." "Tell me more about that." "I never eat sushi from questionable places. I'm obsessive about food safety. But that night, driving past this sketchy convenience store, I stopped and bought sushi that had been sitting under heat lamps for who knows how long. I told myself I was being spontaneous, adventurous." "What were you thinking about as you drove past the store?" David closed his eyes, trying to reconstruct that evening. "The Henderson deal. How it would put me over the top for partnership consideration. How I'd finally made it." He paused. "And how my father would react if he knew I was closing deals worth more money than he'd made in his entire lifetime. How would he react?" "He'd say I'd forgotten where I came from, that I thought I was better than him." David's voice grew quieter. Maybe he'd be right. What would it mean if he were right? That I'd become everything he taught me to hate. That success had corrupted me. Dr. Torres leaned back in his chair. David, what if your father's beliefs about success were wrong? The question felt like blasphemy. He wasn't wrong about everything. He was a good man, honest, hard-working. I'm not questioning his character. I'm questioning his beliefs about what success means. But what if he was right? What if achieving success does change you? What if it does make you entitled, disconnected from regular people? What if it doesn't? What if success is just success? Neutral until you decide what to do with it. David felt something fundamental shifting in his worldview, like tectonic plates rearranging themselves. I never considered that possibility, because considering it would mean all my sabotage has been for nothing. It would mean I've been destroying my own life to stay loyal to a belief system that might not even be true. The weight of that realization was staggering. Over the following weeks, David began to notice the intricate ways his unconscious mind had been protecting him from success. It wasn't just the dramatic sabotages, the inflammatory emails, the convenient illnesses, the relationship-ending fights. It was dozens of smaller choices that consistently pulled him back from the edge of achievement. Missing important calls because his phone was mysteriously on silent. Forgetting to follow up on crucial leads. Arriving at networking events just late enough to miss the key connections. Procrastinating on projects until they were merely good instead of exceptional. Each individual incident could be explained away as human error, but together they formed a pattern so consistent it could only be intentional, even if that intention was buried beneath layers of rationalization. But the most significant moment came when David was offered another opportunity, a position at a boutique firm that would put him on partnership track within 18 months. His first instinct was to find reasons to decline. The firm was too small, the clients were too demanding, the salary, while excellent, wasn't quite enough to justify the stress. But this time, David recognized what he was doing. I'm sabotaging again, he told Dr. Torres. I'm sitting here with exactly the opportunity I've claimed to want, and my mind is generating reasons to reject it. What would happen if you accepted it? I might actually succeed this time. And that terrifies you. Yes, because if I succeed, I become someone my father wouldn't recognize, someone he'd be ashamed of. Dr. Torres was quiet for a moment. David, how old were you when your father died? 16. So the father whose approval you're seeking, whose values you're protecting, is the father from when you were a teenager. David felt something profound clicking into place. Yes. What do you think 45-year-old David's father might think about his son's success? The father who'd lived another 20 years, who'd seen how hard you worked, who'd watched you struggle and grow. The question opened doorways in David's mind that he'd kept locked for decades. I don't know, David admitted. I never considered what he might think now. I've been frozen in his 16-year-old understanding of who I should be. What if that 16-year-old's father would be proud of who you've become? David felt tears threatening, the first he'd allowed himself to shed over his father's death in nearly 20 years. I wish I could ask him. What would you want to ask? If it's okay to be successful. If achieving things means I've betrayed his memory. If he'd still love me if I became everything he taught me to be suspicious of. And what do you think he'd say? David was quiet for a long time, genuinely considering the question, instead of immediately defaulting to his teenage assumptions about his father's values. Maybe he'd say he was wrong to teach me that success was evil. Maybe he'd say he was just scared that if I achieved too much, I'd leave him behind. David paused. Maybe he'd say he loves me regardless of how much I achieve or don't achieve. How does it feel to consider that possibility? Liberating and terrifying. Because if he wouldn't judge me for succeeding, then I have no excuse for sabotaging myself anymore. The realization was both freeing and overwhelming. Without the protection of unconscious sabotage, David would actually have to confront the possibility of getting everything he'd claimed to want. And that meant confronting the possibility of failure that wasn't self-imposed. But it also meant confronting the possibility of success that was real, earned, and his to keep. The job interview at Morrison & Klein went better than any interview David had ever had. He was prepared, articulate, and for the first time in his adult life, he allowed himself to genuinely want the position without simultaneously planning its destruction. When they offered him the job with a clear pathway to partnership, David's first impulse was familiar: find the flaw, identify the reason it wouldn't work, protect himself from the vulnerability of actually trying. But this time, he recognized the impulse for what it was. "I accept," he said, surprising himself with how simple the words sounded. That evening, David called his sister to share the news. "I'm proud of you," she said, "not just for getting the job, but for not finding a way to screw it up." "The screwing up part might still come," David admitted, "but at least now I'll know I'm doing it." 6 months later, David was succeeding in ways that would have triggered his sabotage patterns in the past. His caseload was high profile, his billable hours were impressive, and his colleagues had begun discussing him as partnership material. And for the first time in his adult life, David didn't feel compelled to destroy it. The success didn't feel like betrayal anymore. It felt like finally fulfilling the potential that had been there all along, buried under years of unconscious loyalty to beliefs that had never actually served him. During his final session with Dr. Torres, David reflected on the changes. "I still catch myself looking for ways to sabotage," he admitted. "The old patterns are still there, but now I can see them coming." "What's different about how you handle those impulses now?" I ask myself. Is this serving me, or is this serving a 16-year-old's understanding of what my dead father might think? Most of the time it's the latter. And then what? Then I choose differently. I choose to honor my father by living fully, not by limiting myself to stay loyal to his fears. "How does that feel?" David smiled. "Like I'm finally living my own life instead of someone else's idea of what my life should be." As David left Dr. Torres's office for the last time, he felt something he'd never experienced before: excitement about his own future. Not anxiety about what he might lose, not fear about becoming someone he wouldn't recognize, but genuine anticipation about what he might achieve. For the first time in his life, success felt like permission rather than punishment, and that made all the difference. 3 months later, David was offered junior partnership at Morrison & Klein. As he sat in the partners' meeting, listening to them discuss his qualifications and potential, he felt the familiar urge to find fault, to identify the reasons why he didn't deserve this recognition. But instead of following that impulse, he did something revolutionary. He allowed himself to feel proud. He'd earned this. Not through manipulation or luck, or being in the right place at the right time, but through competence, dedication, and the courage to stop protecting himself from his own potential. After the meeting, David called his sister with the news. "So," she asked, "how are you going to sabotage this one?" David laughed. "I'm not. For the first time in my life, I'm going to let myself have something I've worked for." "How does that feel?" "Terrifying," David admitted, "but also right. Like I'm finally becoming who I was supposed to be all along." That evening, David did something he'd been avoiding for months. He visited his father's grave. "Hey, Dad," he said, sitting cross-legged on the grass the way he used to sit when he was listening to his father's stories. "I made junior partner today. I know you taught me to be suspicious of success, but I think maybe you were wrong about that." The wind moved through the cemetery, rustling the leaves of the oak trees. "I don't think success makes people bad," David continued. "I think what people do with success determines whether it's good or bad, and I want to do good things with mine." As David sat in the growing twilight, he felt something he'd never experienced at his father's grave before. Peace. Not the bitter peace of limitation and self-imposed struggle, but the deeper peace that comes from finally living in alignment with your actual potential. "I'm not going to sabotage this one, Dad," David said finally. "I'm going to succeed, and I'm going to stay decent while I do it. I think that's what you really wanted from me all along." The conversation continued in David's mind as he drove home, but it was different now. Instead of the scared teenager asking for permission to achieve, it was a grown man making peace with his own ambitions. David Brennan had spent 20 years perfecting the art of almost. Now he was ready to master the art of actually. And for the first time in his life, that felt like exactly where he belonged. The job interview at Morrison & Klein went better than any interview David had ever had. He was prepared, articulate, and for the first time in his adult life, he allowed himself to genuinely want the position without simultaneously planning its destruction. When they offered him the job, with a clear pathway to partnership, David's first impulse was familiar. Find the flaw, identify the reason it wouldn't work, protect himself from the vulnerability of actually trying. But this time, he recognized the impulse for what it was. "I accept," he said, surprising himself with how simple the words sounded. 6 months later, David was succeeding in ways that would have triggered his sabotage patterns in the past. His caseload was high profile, his billable hours were impressive, and his colleagues had begun discussing him as partnership material. And for the first time in his adult life, David didn't feel compelled to destroy it. The real test came when he was assigned lead counsel on the firm's biggest case of the year, a corporate restructure that would determine his partnership prospects. His old patterns immediately activated: find reasons to decline, identify ways he wasn't qualified, protect himself from visible failure. "I'm having sabotage thoughts," he told Dr. Torres. "Big ones." "What does that voice sound like?" David listened to his internal dialogue. "It sounds like my father, the scared father who was convinced that good things don't happen to people like us." "What would your father think if he could see you now?" David considered this seriously. Maybe he'd say he loves me regardless of how much I achieve. Maybe he'd tell me to go for it. The case became David's laboratory for practicing success without sabotage. Every day brought opportunities to undermine himself. But now he could see these moments coming like weather patterns. When the client praised his strategy, instead of deflecting the compliment, David said simply, "Thank you. I'm glad the work is meeting your needs." When colleagues complimented his analysis, he thanked them instead of diminishing his contribution. For the first time in his career, David allowed himself to be competent without apology. The case concluded successfully. David was promoted to junior partner, and for the first time in his adult life, David felt no impulse to find ways to diminish what he'd accomplished. "I think I understand the difference now," David told Dr. Torres during their final session, "between success that feels stolen and success that feels earned." "What's the difference?" "Success that feels earned comes with confidence because I know exactly how much work went into achieving it. I can claim it without feeling like an imposter." "How does that truth feel?" "Solid. Like I'm finally standing on ground I built myself." David Brennan had spent 20 years perfecting the art of almost, convinced that real achievement would somehow corrupt him. Now he understood that the only corrupting force had been his own fear of becoming who he was capable of being. And that realization had set him free to finally succeed without sabotage. Names and details changed for privacy. inspired by Jungian therapeutic principles.